Ladies and gentlemen, I am very pleased to have with us our next keynote speaker joining us online, Ms. Katherine Soucie, an artist, designer, and educator in textile and sustainable practices. Ms. Katherine is a Canadian UK award winning artist and designer who specializes in transforming textile industry waste into new textiles, clothing, and sculptural forms. Ms. Catherine is a recipient of BC Creative Achievements Award 2006 Canada, shortlisted for Niche Award 2007 USA, and the recipient of the International Design Green Award 2008 USA. She is a noted public speaker, juror, and educator. We are very glad to have with us Ms. Catherine all the way from London. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Catherine. Over to you, ma'am.
Hello and good morning from London. I just want to say thank you for including me in today's series of events. It's an honor and a pleasure. And I'm really excited to be able to share aspects of my sustainable research and practice from the last almost 20 years. So I'm just going to pull up my presentation. Just bear with me for a moment. Okay, so I just want to start off with the title of my presentation today is based on an acronym that's reflective of my design research method and practice, and it's MEND. And this is a method that I've established in working with waste materials over the years, and it's something that I connect with when I understand when it comes to empowering my roots. So just to introduce myself a little bit today, it's important to situate my practice, my alternative approach to working with waste materials. So I'm an artist who works with textile waste in the discarded. I'm a designer who transforms waste, utilizes obsolete clothing and textile machinery, and incorporates traditional artisanal techniques in response to my heritage and the environments that we currently live in. I also remix mending artisanal handcraft applications with obsolete and digital technologies derived from my formal training in fashion and textiles in order to produce zero waste textiles and byproducts using a particular method and business model I established using M.E.N.D, which is a creative reuse design research tool and system. So I established Soucie, which is my label studio, back in 2003 in Vancouver, and I relocated in 2019 to work a little bit more closely with Pierre, because in the time between 2003 and 2019, I was working specifically with mills based in Canada and the United States. And so my material research focused on the zero waste production and the transformation of pre-consumer waste hosiery using a completely circular design. All the dyes, techniques, inks, materials used were creatively used and reused using a hybrid method of craft applications with obsolete and digital technology. So this is just what I was introducing. This is essentially what I just mentioned around my research and practice from 2003 to 2019. It gives you an image of also what the base material that I'm working with. So I've established a completely zero waste design method and material out of pre-consumer waste hosiery. And so this is an image of actually around 300 pounds of waste hosiery that I use a completely circular and zero dry method. We're using metal-free acid-dyes for nylon. And so this is essentially the beginning process of the circular that I've used to establish not only for the textile collections that I've developed and produced, but they get further transformed into clothing, costume, accessory, 3D forms, as well as installations and in sculptures. So just to kind of introduce you, to give you a little bit of context into how I incorporate craft applications with obsolete and digital technologies, this is just sort of like a real gentle survey into combine these methods because I come from an artisanal background in textiles as well as fashion. And so this method was essentially developed as a solution to find new ways of incorporating craft with manufacturing using waste materials. And at the time when I was beginning this research, I was collecting machinery because of a lot of the offshoring that was happening in North America, specifically in Vancouver at the time. So I was buying up old equipment that was being discarded, and I was experimenting with it in these non-traditional ways to essentially generate new material forms. It was through those methods and through my experimentation, I also discovered that a zero waste method of printing onto this delicate material made it completely, it didn't run or pill through the process, which is one of the issues with producing hosiery, is that it runs in pills. So through the different combined methods that I established, it allowed for me to further develop this material process using other garment making methods. And some of the digital technology that I've used to shape and tailor garments is using digital embroidery. So I've used it as a tailoring tool in a complete zero waste way to shape the garment, and as well as the material in the same process. And also using a method of subtraction garment cutting that I studied under a UK designer who established this method, Julian Roberts, and through my use of the zero waste dyeing, printing, and digital embroidery method, I was able to create a series of outcomes. And these are just some of the examples of garments that I produced using this particular method. But it has gone on to establish my understanding of creative reuse. And what you see here are just some examples from some collections produced. You can imagine when you do this type of material research and development, especially when it comes to sustainability, especially in the early days, it took on a lot of education, and not just within industry and within a higher education context, but with the general public as a whole. So, through the bits that I've established, I was also integrating and finding new ways of creatively using and reusing garments from previous collections and reinterpreting them and keeping them in complete circulation throughout this sort of life cycle of what I was trying to develop, along with the language that I was trying to establish as a designer, working with waste materials within a zero waste context. So over the years, you can imagine the materials that I've developed through the different methods, through the different applications. I mean, it's still very much an ongoing process for me. It's the material research and development never ends. And so, it really is dependent on the type of waste that I acquire and mill. So each collection, each creative response that I've established has really been reflective of my method of using MEND. And so I just want to share with you a little bit about how mending as a philosophy has not only established my understanding of how I creatively respond to materials, but how I undertake and perform research. Because it's not just a term that is reflective of the care, repair of materials, but I also extend that into with the tools and with the other methods. So it's a philosophy that essentially drives how I only generate the sustainable solutions that I create, but it's how I choose to use it as a form of communicating as a designer. So why I use this term MEND, and it actually came about is when I was doing my master's thesis, and it was a way for me to organize how I take creative material research, especially creative material research using a waste material stream like hosiery. Give me a space to establish a system. So M stands for the method, what my methods are. The E stands for what I undertake as part of my material research and exploration. The N refers to how I navigate and establish that system. And D, design, stands for what the outcomes are. And so just to give you some examples, so this is breaking down my process even a little bit further in relation to the method. I've shared with you what my dyeing process is. When it comes to the printing method and what makes it so unique and what I've established through the zero waste method is the materials that I actually use that capture the waste materials actually become new materials that end up becoming educational tools or materials that are used part of other elements of the creative process in whether it's in photo shoots, whether they become design products as well, or they become art pieces that I exhibit in relation to the clothing and textiles that I produce. So everything is creatively captured, used, and reused. This is just an image you can see of a very improvised way when we work with some waste materials that have been dyed. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes. It's really important that we implement the printing method because it does allow for this material to be completely machine washable and dryable or hand washed to dry. It's essential in its overall life cycle of this material and for the products that I produce out of it. But sometimes we have to adapt some of the traditional artisanal methods in response to working with the inconsistency of working with waste materials as a way to generate the necessary methods that we need established and explore. So you see on the screen here are just is the relationship between materials that are stored off to the side that are in process in relation to some outcomes that eventually gets transpired into. But when it comes to also understanding the methods that are necessary to produce a sustainable research and design practices, you need to find a way that really, and methods that really speak to your personal heritage, but also your understanding of knowledge of how you want to use these methods as a form of visual communication, especially within the field of sustainability. There's so much out there that is a possibility, not just in working with waste materials, but in working with tools, reimagining the traditional methods, as well as tools that have been forgotten in new ways. And the way that I've done that is I've adapted broken machinery, I've done a variety of things that has allowed for me to create a very unique textile byproduct, as well as outcomes that really speak to my design philosophy and my label, Soucie. But the other thing that's really important, that's really part of the roots of what motivates how I think and how I approach using creative reuse as a design tool, is the fact that I work with waste materials. I not only work with the actual source material that comes from the manufacturing process, but all aspects I'm very mindful and I interview and I capture all different aspects of the methods that are utilized as well as all of the outcomes. So it's really important that I honor all the different methods that are used and undertaken in the process of M.E.N.D. And so what's important to establish here is through my year producing textiles and clothing out of pre-consumer waste hosiery is that when it came to establishing a relationship within the community outside of the design outcomes that I've created, I was only enough materials that was my design label. It's not like I was mass manufacturing the textiles to be used designers, but that got open in around 2008, 2009, when I started to multi-yarn that was being sold to a variety of designers, rug makers, jewelry designers, furniture designers, and embroidery designers, and furniture designers. And so these are just some examples of some of the scraps from the process that usually gets used to produce accessory collections under my label Soucie. But this is some other things that were allowing for me to feel a community who was wanting to buy specific materials and resources. So when it comes to understanding how, when you've established a research method using alternative methods and a material resource that's evolved to an industrial approach like you constantly have to allow for your material and tools that you work with to translate in new ways, especially when it comes to understanding designing for circularity. It isn't a method that is closed. There's going to be obviously opportunities for evolution to happen in the process. And as I've observed waste at various different levels of my own creative process, but as an industry professional over the years, it's allowed for me to develop a language as well as a design aesthetic that's reflective of how I choose to mend and blend different methods, artisanal methods, with different forms of technology, whether that's obsolete or whether that's using digital technology. But it's really about transforming our understanding of our tools and materials, and also using it as an opportunity to educate, not just within the field of fashion and textiles, but within the general public. So this is also why I'm taking the opportunity here to situate the things that I want to say that I can't really say all the time in fashion, using the materials and methods to educate and also invoke thought around waste materials in our environment. So this is just a brief manifesto that reflects the M.E.N.D philosophy that I undertake, which I also believe that it's important for any student, anybody that is entering the field of design, whether it's through textiles or fashion or a combination of, is to establish a manifesto for yourself so that it really speaks to your own value system and how you see the world, and where do you want to situate yourself, and who do you want to be in conversation with, and where do you want to contribute. These are just some of the things that I constantly reflect upon and which continue to motivate and inform my understanding of what sustainability means and what it means to me both on a personal level but also as a professional. So this kind of brings me to the tail end of my presentation. And my question is, how can experimental textile and fashion research empower your roots? And in my case, I come from a mixed heritage. Obviously, you can tell from my accent, it is a Canadian accent, but I come from a British background that's also mixed with First Nations. And so for me, having part Aboriginal heritage, it is something that is reflected in how the aesthetics that I choose and how I also understand the role of being what we keeper of the earth. So my job is to really be a steward of the earth and use materials that reflect elements that I believe require solutions. And of course, we're moving more forward as an industry to produce less waste at the manufacturing level, but there's still so much manufacturing waste that does exist. And as long as it's being manufactured, it is always going to be a vehicle for me to continue to express and co-create with other designers, with other artists, with students, using materials and methods that will help shape and form a new form of language when it comes to understanding how we can use creative reuse as a design research method. So, in closing, I want to thank you so much for your patience, obviously in the beginning with the presentation not showing immediately, but thank you so very much for the opportunity for me to share my research and practice, and I hope that it gives you some idea about the valuable role that waste materials and methods, what it has to offer, tool for research, and as a creative material resource. So thank you very much.